Hi guys, we will be discussing chapter 9 in this video lecture. So what is chapter 9 about? You know that there are three stages in the life of a contract of sale. We have the negotiation stage, we have the perfection stage, and the last stage, which is the stage of delivery. So in that span of time, guys, what is the rule if, for example, the thing being sold, the subject matter of the contract of sale will get lost, or it will deteriorate, or get damaged? Who will bear the risk of loss? Will it be the buyer or the seller? How about if the thing being sold will bear fruit or earn interest, or if any improvement falls upon that subject matter of the contract of sale? Who is entitled to those fruits and other benefits? Is it the seller or the buyer? Because the essence of a contract of sale, guys, is the transmission of ownership, right? The ownership will be transferred from the seller to the buyer. And we know that it is the owner who will bear the risk of loss for fortuitous events. And it is also the owner who is entitled to fruits and other improvements on the thing that he or she owns. But considering that there's this three stages in a contract of sale, what happens if the thing being sold gets lost after perfection but before delivery? Because in delivery, that's when ownership is transferred. Okay. And during perfection, that's the time when there is a meeting of the minds and when the buyer and the seller will assume reciprocal, bilateral, and reciprocal obligations. So we need to know the rules on who will bear the risk of loss, especially in fortuitous events. Before perfection, guys, and after delivery, very simple lang atong i-apply na rule. It will just be res perit domino. Because in those two instances, we know without a doubt who is the owner already of the thing being sold or of the subject matter. So before perfection, the seller is still the owner. Well, after delivery, it is already the buyer who is the owner. So we apply the rule res perit domino. During perfection, guys, at the very moment of perfection, there is a special article found in the law on sales, and that's Article 1493 and 1494. It provides the rule on what happens when the thing is lost at the very moment of perfection. And there are also several articles found not just in the law on sales, but in other chapters and titles of the Civil Code, which gives us different rules on who will bear the loss after perfection of the contract, but before its delivery. So it's not shown here, but there are actually three distinct articles that is found in our civil code. There's Article 1480, which is shown here in the slide. There's Article 1538, and there's also Article 1504. So we'll study them deeper in the coming slides. So loss before perfection, res perit domino, guys. So general rule, if there is fortuitous loss, the risk is borne by the owner of the thing, okay, at the time of the loss. How about at the moment of perfection? So we have Article 1493 and 1494. So 1493 provides this rule. If the thing is entirely lost, then the contract shall be without any effect. If there is only partial loss, then the buyer is given the option of either withdrawing from the contract or demanding only the remaining part. Okay, and the buyer here must pay a proportionate price to the total sum agreed upon. In 1494, however, if there is a situation wherein the seller and the buyer perfected a contract of sale, however, at that time, the seller has no knowledge that the thing has already perished or wholly or materially deteriorated in quality. So there's no malice here on the part of the seller. Wag yun siya idea. Ni perish na or ni deteriorate na ang subject matter. So the buyer is given also options under Article 1494. So the buyer can avoid the sale totally. So pwede niya ipa-nullify. Or the buyer can treat the sale as valid only in those goods that are still existing or those that have not deteriorated. Okay, but this rule is applicable when the subject matter of the sale is divisible. Sakyanan be. Ma-divide niya nimo. Sakyanan baligya. Naguba ang iyahang kuan. Makina. So no choice but to avoid or nullify the sale if the subject matter is not divisible. Right, so let's take a look at the third rule, which is who bears the risk of loss, who is entitled to the fruit after perfection but before delivery. So we have Article 1480. So you see this article, guys, it references to several articles found in the Law on Obligations and Contracts, Articles 1163 to 1165 and Article 1262. And this article, guys, it expressly states that it is applicable to the sale of fungible things. So these are the provisions that 1480 refers to. And we understand here that the debtor will be the vendor or the seller, while the creditor will be the buyer or the vendee. So remember these articles, that if there is an obligation to give, then that person so obliged must take care of the thing with the diligence of a good father of the family. 1164 states that the buyer already has the right to the fruits of the thing from the time the obligation to deliver it arises. So kung nagsabot si seller and buyer that the thing will be delivered on this particular date, then from that date, the fruits or interest will be for the buyer already. 1165 here says that when what is to be delivered is a determinate thing, so the buyer, in addition to the right granted under 1170, can compel the seller to make the delivery. But if it is generic, then the buyer can ask that the obligation be complied with at the expense of the seller. But remember, if the subject matter is generic, then it must be at least determinable at the time of perfection and already physically segregated at the time of delivery. In 1262, guys, when the obligation is also to deliver a determinate thing, and if it is lost or destroyed without the fault of the seller, and before any default or delay, then the obligation is extinguished. However, if it is stipulated that the seller is still liable despite the fortuitous loss, then it will not extinguish the obligation, but the seller will be responsible for damages. So 1480, guys. Remember the rule that in case of fortuitous event and the thing being sold is lost or destroyed, then it is the buyer who will assume the risk of loss. Okay, without fault man si seller ani, fortuitous event gani ang nakakos sa loss. Okay, provided that the seller exercised due diligence and there was no delay yet at the time of the loss. Right, but there's another article found in the Law on Sales, Article 1504. So in this particular article, it says here that goods remain at the seller's risk until ownership therein is transferred to the buyer. So there's no qualification here with respect to fortuitous loss. It's clear here that the risk of loss will remain with the seller until he has effected the transfer of ownership to the buyer, and that is when the seller has already delivered the thing. Okay, unless, however, there is an agreement that the ownership is already transferred to the buyer, whether or not there is actual delivery. So depende sa ilahang contract, but that's the general rule is that as found in Article 1504, it will be at the seller's risk until ownership is transferred. So nare exceptions aning a rule when the delivery of the goods has already been made to the buyer or to the bailee of the buyer, and the ownership in the goods is retained by the seller only to secure performance. Or when actual delivery is delayed through the fault of either the buyer or seller, then the goods will be at the risk of the party at fault. So 1504, guys, remember na ang seller ani ang nag-assume sa risk of loss until the thing has been delivered to the buyer. General rule. Okay, and this is the third article that provides rules on who assumes or bears the risk of loss. So in 1538, guys, enumerate dyan niya today that in case of loss, deterioration, or improvement of the thing before its delivery, the rules found in Article 1189 shall be observed, the vendor being considered the debtor. And in 1189, it's clear there that if the thing is lost without the fault of the seller, the obligation shall be extinguished. So, dili na ganyan siya nag-refer of fortuitous event. As long as the loss is without fault of the seller, the obligation is extinguished. Same with deterioration, guys. If no fault si seller sa pag-deteriorate sa subject matter, then the impairment is to be borne by the buyer. Okay, and if ever the seller is at fault, then the buyer can choose between rescission of the obligation and its fulfillment or its fulfillment with indemnity for damages. As to improvement, guys, it shall inure to the benefit of the buyer. But if the improvement is at the expense of the seller, then the seller shall have no other right except that granted to a usufructuary. So remember 1189 with respect to the rule on loss, deterioration, or improvement of the thing before its delivery, as stated in Article 1538. So what's the difference between these three articles? It's Article 1480, 1504, and 1538. So in 1480, guys, in case of fortuitous event, it will be the buyer who will bear the risk of loss. Okay, fortuitous event man, absolved si seller. The obligation to deliver is extinguished. In 1504, the goods remain at the seller's risk until ownership is transferred. So after perfection, but before delivery, it will be at the seller's risk. In 1538, when we refer to Article 1189, if the loss is without the fault of the seller, then the obligation is extinguished. So what article do we apply in a given situation? Right? We'll get back to this slide. I want you to appreciate the difference between the three articles. So there are three views on who bears the risk of loss. So let's take a look at this question. A and B entered into a contract whereby the former agreed to sell his automobile to the latter for 25,000 pesos. Upon perfection of the contract, B advanced the entire purchase price to A. It was stipulated that the automobile shall be delivered to B at the end of March 1972. Unfortunately, before the arrival of that date, it was completely destroyed without any fault of A. Can B now recover the amount which she had already advanced to A? So if we apply the provisions of Article 1504 only, it is clear that the loss is imputable to the vendor. Consequently, A must return to B the 25,000 pesos. Remember 1504? Goods remain at the seller's risk until ownership is transferred to the buyer. Okay, but if we apply Article 1538 and we observe the rules provided in Article 1189, then the obligation is extinguished since the object was lost without any fault of the vendor. Okay, but if we apply Article 1480 only, then there is an implication that the loss is imputable to the vendee, an implication which is directly in conflict with that which is expressly declared in 1504. So in 1480, guys, which references 1282 of the Civil Code, the obligation is also extinguished if the object was lost without any fault of the vendor. So what then is meant by the law when it says that if the object of an obligation is lost or destroyed without any fault of the vendor, that the obligation is extinguished? So remember, guys, that in a contract of sale, it's a bilateral and reciprocal contract, which gives rise to bilateral and reciprocal obligations. So on the part of the seller will be the obligation to transfer ownership. And he does that by delivering the subject matter. On the part of the buyer, he will pay the price. So which obligation is extinguished? Is it the obligation to deliver, or is it the obligation to pay the price, or both? So the extinguishment of the obligation due to fortuitous loss or loss without the fault of the seller or the buyer. These obligations The extinguishment of the obligations affects both the vendor and the vendee because their obligations are reciprocal. So if the obligation to deliver on the part of the seller is extinguished by fortuitous loss, then the correlative obligation to pay also is extinguished. So that's the first view. The second view is that when the thing sold is lost without any fault of the vendor, he is already released from delivering the thing, while the vendee's obligation to pay the price subsists. And if there was advance payment, such as what happened in the facts shown in the question, then the vendor can keep the price. The legal effect, therefore, is that the vendee assumes the risk of loss by fortuitous event from the time of perfection of the contract up to the time of delivery. So, di tayo mag-advance payment, guys, no? Okay, matiway niya ito ba? And the third view is that Article 1504 applies only to specific goods, while Article 1480 is applicable only to fungible goods. So what is the better view to adopt? So kaning first two views, guys, there are adequate or sufficient legal basis, okay, both Philippine and Spanish in origin. And kaning third view is backed up daw by authorities of American origin. Okay, but it is submitted, however, that the first is more just and equitable. Besides, it is in conformity with the principle of res perit domino. So the owner of the thing must bear the risk of loss. Consequently, A, the vendor must return the price to B. So in gist, guys, ang preferred na rule to apply will be 1480, no? As well as 1504. Oh, not 1480. The rule na gi-apply in this question is the rule is 1504 and 1538 and 1480 sad. So summary on the rules on loss. Before perfection and after delivery, res perit domino. If at the time of perfection, then contract is void or inexistent or of no effect. If the thing is lost after perfection but before delivery, and even before ownership is transferred to the buyer, the risk of loss is shifted to the buyer as an exception to the rule of res perit domino. If we apply Article 1480, but remember 1504 and 1538. So, depende ninyo guys kung saan niyo pag-justify yung answer. But, at least now you know, there are three views on who bears fortuitous loss. So, kani siya nga question, the preferred answer of the author is the application of 1504 and 1538. KB advanced 3,000 to S in payment of 600 picols of sugar. The written contract did not specify that the sugar was to come from the crop on S's land, which was destroyed by a flood. S claimed that the fortuitous cause excused non-performance by him of the contract. Is S correct? So what was to be delivered by S was generic. It was sugar. So any sugar of the quality stipulated, regardless of origin or however acquired, would be obligatory on the part of B to receive. And that will be the time when S would be discharged from the obligation to deliver. It seems therefore plain that the sugar to be sold not having been segregated, the sale was not perfected, and the loss of the crop, even though force majeure, did not extinguish S obligation to deliver. So flood, like other catastrophe, was a contingency, a collateral incident, which S should have provided for by proper stipulations. So, Janice nun kwam, perwit dayang gi-apply ani guys. Remember na you have to make the generic subject matter if not determinate at the time of perfection, then at least determinable. And if it was not done so, then it remains a generic thing. And if there is fortuitous loss of a generic thing, then generic naman siya. So the obligation will subsist. The seller must still deliver. And it should be the generic thing must be delivered in accordance with the quality stipulated in the contract. So D sold a second-hand car to E for 150,000. The agreement between D and E was that half of the purchase price, or 75,000, should be paid upon delivery of the car to E, and the balance shall be paid in 5 equal monthly installments. The car was delivered to E, and E paid the down payment. Less than 1 month, however, the car was stolen from E's garage with no fault on E's part, and it was never recovered. So is E still bound to pay the balance of 75,000 pesos? So yun kayo guys. Of course, na-deliver na sa iyaha, so E must pay. He already owns the car. A sold an automobile to B for 20,000 pesos to be paid as follows: 10,000 upon delivery and the balance at the rate of 2,000 pesos every 3 months thereafter. The automobile, however, was burned in the possession of B without his fault before the payment of the balance. Is B obliged to pay the balance? So the same with the previous question, still obliged to pay. Resperit domino. Kasi yun, baan niya akong ibutang na questions dire. S, an American resident of Manila about to leave on vacation, sold his car to B for $2,000. The payment to be made 10 days after delivery to X, a third-party depositary, who shall thereafter deliver the car to B, the buyer, upon receipt by X of the purchase price. So si X na third person. Sa iyaha i-deliver ang subject matter, siya say modawat sa bayad. O siya mo turn over sa bayad to the seller. It was stipulated in this contract, guys, that ownership is retained by S until delivery of the car to X. 5 days after delivery of the car to X, it was destroyed in a fire which gutted the house of X without the fault of either X or B. Is B still legally obligated to pay the purchase price? So there is delivery to the third-party depositary or the bailee. And the agreement was that ownership remained with the seller only up until delivery of the car to X. So there is already a transfer of ownership here, guys, from S, the seller, to B, the buyer. So therefore, resperit domino, it will be the buyer who will bear the loss, the fortuitous loss of the car. So even if it was agreed that S shall retain ownership of the car until the purchase price has been paid by B, the end result will still be the same, since evidently the purpose is only to secure performance. So this is one of the exceptions found in Article 1504. Right, so that concludes our lecture on Chapter 9. Okay, I will upload a separate video for Chapter 10 on remedies. See you in the next video, guys.